US Chapter 22, Section 2, Ford and Carter years. So what was the most important factor leading to changes in American attitudes during the 70s? Evaluate the presidency of Ford, the domestic policies of Jimmy Carter, and then how American society is changing in the 1970s. So when you look at Ford, his background, he was a football star at the University of Michigan. He then went on to serve in the U.S. Navy during World War II, and based on that war record, like many of the people of his generation, he went into public service, and he spent 25 years in the House of Representatives, and he had elevated himself to being the Speaker of the House. So if we look at what are the biggest issues facing the U.S. today, according to public polling in August of 1974, you can see that pretty much everything is getting crowded out by economic issues, especially the cost of living. So when we look at some of the problems that Ford is facing, one is Watergate and the credibility gap of the 1960s. In addition to all of the protests and the civil rights movement, many Americans are kind of frustrated, they're tired, they're concerned, and they really distrust government. So when Ford pardons Nixon of all the charges in the Watergate scandal, public opinion really turns against him rapidly. They accuse him of setting up some kind of a secret deal, that Nixon appointed Ford so that Ford would eventually pardon Nixon, that there's this quid pro quo going on. There's no evidence of that, but it really doesn't matter because that's what the American people think. So when you look at the 1974 midterm elections, it's brutal for Ford. And so that's what this chart down below shows you, is approval ratings for different presidents and then midterm election years or election years. And if they have not very good ratings, they tend to lose an awful lot of seats in Congress. And so that's just something that people kind of look at as a bit of a bellwether, as they look at popularity ratings and midterm elections, and they can kind of get a feel for how well a president is doing or not doing. So that's why, if you are listening, a lot of people are talking about the 2018 midterm elections and see what comes of those. So when you look at other problems that Ford is facing, the economy is really in a tailspin. Double-digit inflation, which makes most things unaffordable, which is why the primary concern for most Americans is the cost of living. That inflation has made it so they can't buy things. Consumer goods definitely, and even like food and necessities are pretty tough. So Ford comes up with this whip inflation now, and the problem with this is his programs actually make the economy worse. So you see more factories closing. Consumers are totally have lost faith in the economy, and so consumer spending drops. People are trying to save and scrimp and get by. And then with the factories closing and demand dropping, the other factor here is then unemployment goes up, and then as you have more people unemployed, more factories close and less money is spent, and it becomes kind of a vicious cycle. So when you get to the 1976 election, Americans are looking for someone who's totally outside of the political mainstream. They want an outsider. And Jimmy Carter, a Georgia governor and peanut farmer, fits the bill. So when you look at all of these factors, how crazy the 60s were, the stagflation, the Watergate scandal, what Americans want is anybody but an establishment politician. And that's what they get with Jimmy Carter. From the very beginning, though, Carter runs into some roadblocks. His inexperience and his being an outsider doesn't work in Washington. Being a Washington outsider is very difficult to come into a presidency, and so our current president is experiencing these exact same things. When you don't have these close political ties, when you aren't like a Lyndon Johnson where you can call back on some of your friends from the Senate to help you get things done, it gets really tough. And so even though Carter's sending all kinds of bills to Congress, his own political party is working against him. And another factor is when he gives amnesty to those people who dodged the draft in the Vietnam War. That isn't very popular, and it's not very popular even with members of his own political party. So he continues to try and deal with inflation and energy crisis. It just gets super tough because the economy just isn't in a place where it can grow. The best you can kind of hope for is that it just doesn't continue to get worse. So between inflation and the high cost of oil and heating, it's taking a toll on Americans. And we're just struggling. On top of that, Japanese and German competitors are able to produce goods at a more efficient rate, at a cheaper rate, and so Americans aren't buying American-made goods. So when you look at the fuel shortage, that's related to what we talked about with OPEC. So OPEC really clamps down on the amount of oil that's available, and that impacts heating costs. So right at the same time that this is happening, we have 77 and 78 were miserable winters, and so you have much higher heating costs because of the winters and the lack of oil and petroleum. And you end up seeing more and more factories and businesses close because they can't afford the goods that they need to produce. They can't afford to continue to pay their workers, and it's just a really tough combination. President Carter sends a conservation tax bill to Congress in the hopes that would encourage people to stop using so much oil. It didn't pass, and so it really didn't have the impact that it needed to. He does get Paul Volcker in, who changes monetary policy, who raises interest rates, and that helps deal with inflation. And so eventually inflation is going to decrease, and we're going to kind of stabilize the economy a little bit. The other thing that's happening at this time, and this is a continuation of the trend that we've already talked about, people are leaving the Midwest and the Rust Belt, and they're heading towards the Sun Belt. And so that's going to give those people in those southern states more political power. The other thing you start to see is Latin and Asian American immigrants coming in, and it changes the face of America, and it's changing the outlook and the makeup of the United States. For the me generation, what you see coming out of the 1960s is a group of people who are more focused on themselves than they are really on too many other things. So what you see is you get 2 times more the divorces from 1960 whatever to the 1970s. You see more and more kids are born out of wedlock. You see some of these fitness and meditation movements. You see a lot of self-help books coming out in the 1970s. Again, just looking at this generation that's focused more on themselves than what's happening on the outside. When we look at television in the 1970s, it really kind of changes quite a bit. It breaks new ground. So you've got All in the Family, which is dealing with issues, MASH, Saturday Night Live. These are all covering issues that are upsetting to people, and that it's pushing the boundaries a little bit and making people examine American society and politics and all those types of things. And the other thing you see on TV is more and more minorities. Sanford and Son, Chico and the Man, Roots, which is a mini-series dealing with slavery. You see television begin to reflect all the different aspects of American society instead of a more limited, like 1950s cookie cutter style of life. The other thing is you start to see a religious resurgence. The number of people who identify themselves as evangelical Christians increases to about 20%. You start to see far more televangelists on TV, and eventually what's going to happen is these 2 things are going to combine to create what's going to be known as the conservative coalition or the conservative right. And these people are going to form a very powerful voting bloc, which is going to influence some of the upcoming elections. So they have more than just religious things that they're voting on. They're also wanting smaller government, and they want a stronger foreign policy and more defense spending. So they're united not just religiously, but also in terms of political points of view. And this is going to become, like I said, a very important group where if you want to do well as a Republican, you need to tap into this religious coalition, or you're just not going to do very well.